Thank you.
Just to check the mic, can you hear me? Good, excellent. Well, thanks so much for staying. I know 4:30, that they can get long even after you have so much fun listening to all these tax papers. So, as Dominika said, I was asked to do this on Saturday. I was in a long bike ride, and after a long bike ride, I came home and I found my phone full of text messages. So it's kind of like, scrambling to reply, and you have your phone full of messages from Wojciech and Jim saying like, you need to do this, but in 2 days. Like, the first thing you do is you panic, So, I panicked, like, what am I going to do in 2 days? And then I thought, this actually could be really fun. It could be a different kind of talk than the one I usually get to give. In a lot of the talks that I give, I spend a lot of time trying to convince the audience that we've gotten the problem right, that we've really done a lot of the robustness checks, and that we've gotten that particular question nailed down tight. And what we don't really get to do in those kind of seminars is kind of give the bigger picture of why we're attacking a given problem in a particular way, or try to think about how the approach that we're taking in one paper is connecting to the rest of the literature. So what I'm going to try to do in today's talk is to talk about 4 different papers in a bit of a shorter time span, and then try to think about those papers from how we're approaching it with my co-authors issues in international tax that I think have their own sets of complications. And I think the overall goal for me today is to try to motivate people to get into international tax by showing that there are different approaches that one can take to studying international tax, where I think there's a lot of very important questions that are understudied. Now, having said that, because I only prepared this in a couple of days, I would have wished to been able to do a broad literature review of all the great works that I'm building on. I know a lot of people in this room have laid the foundations for what I'm doing, so I apologize that I'm not going to have a lot of citations to all the great work that you have been doing. All right, so the other thing I want to say is that all of this is joint work with co-authors. So I wanted to start by thanking all of my co-authors, so Rosanna Altschuler, Leif Boller, and Dan Garrett, who are students of mine at Duke, Eric Horn, Dina Pomerantz, and Gabriel Suckman. I've learned a lot from them, and so this is, trying to communicating what they've taught me over the years. I also didn't put these slides by myself. I had a lot of help from Kevin Roberts, who's actually in the audience, and 3 of my research fellows, Claire Doyle, Jason Harrison, and Maya Donovan, who actually have, helped put this together. So I just want to thank them. All right, so now just getting deep into the topic of the talk. So I wanted to start by just reflecting a little bit on what have been some of the big advances in public economics. And if I think about, 10, 15, 20 years ago, what I think of it's been like really a sea change in public econ research has just been the advent of administrative tax data. I think administrative data in general have revolutionized many different fields in economics. And it's almost easy to forget that public finance was one of the first movers in this area. I try to think a little bit about why it was that this admin tax data has supercharged empirical research. And I kind of thought of 2 particular things. I think one of them is when we're trying to write a paper and we're trying to present it in front of seminar audiences, the thing that we're trying to do is convince the participants or the readers that we have a very well-defined research design, where we can say we're going to make very precise comparisons between a group of people or firms that are being affected by policy and a group that isn't. And I think having these big data sets allows researchers to make these narrow, credible comparisons in ways that we were not able to do before. In a way, some of the papers that do this very well, it's kind of like finding a needle in a haystack. You have a lot of people, and then you find exactly the ones that are actually being affected and some that are not. In particular, you can think of different research methods that are very data hungry, where you actually having a lot of these data really helps you. Some things like regression kink or regression discontinuity. A second issue is that when we try to publish a paper, we want to say that we can actually show something precisely, that we have statistical precision, and having big data really helps with that. When I think about international tax, I think it's actually benefited less from having this admin data. Right? And so I'm going to try to convince you that that's the case. And the reason why, this is not just me complaining like, we really in international tax haven't really benefited that much. I think it actually has important implications. And the reason is, as researchers, you want to publish good papers. And if editors or referees or seminar audiences don't actually appreciate the nuances of the setting that you're studying, it's kind of hard to get a lot of traction on important questions. And so my worry is that really smart researchers are not actually learning the context of international tax, are not devoting their efforts to working in this area, and instead working on other questions where there's more data availability. So I think that's something that my goal today is to try to convince you there are other ways to try to use data to think about international tax. All right, so why do I say that international tax has benefited less? So let's think about some of the challenges in doing tax research with multinationals. My first, always worry when I think about a problem in international tax is that multinational firms are really big, and there's few of them, right? So few and large firms account for a large share of economic activity. So it's really hard to find similar control firms for, say, a large firm like General Electric. Like it's just a hard thing to do. This is very different than when you say look at individuals in personal income tax. In addition, this is more something that happens in other areas of say, for instance, in personal income tax. People that are trying to evade their taxes also are engaged in hidden behaviors that are being hidden from the researcher as well. So firms are also engaged in this kind of behaviors. They often are more sophisticated in the way they do these things. Another complication is that, when we think about personal income taxes, we're kind of familiar about the definitions of income, the definitions of, what's in the tax data. It turns out that when you actually think about what variables mean when you think about corporations, sometimes the name of the variable is not what you think it means, right? And so here I think working with accountants is very important to understand, first of all, what these variables mean, and then also what are the differences between data that are coming from accounting statements and data that are coming from tax statements, because they can be complicated. And then finally, if you're somebody like me who really wants to think about how different policies impact not just firms, but also workers, I think a big problem is that we don't have a lot of really good data sets that combine information on the workers and on the firms together. So these are some of the challenges that I think we face, just on the data measurement front. In addition, when you're trying to think about, okay, how do we do a research design in this area? Well, you can try to find very clever ways to say, here's a firm that was affected by a policy, here's a firm that's not affected by a policy, they kind of look similar. And even if you're able to make that comparison, there's some difficulties in how far you can get with firm-to-firm comparisons. So first of all, many of the policies that impact multinationals either affect all multinationals at the same time, or they are different regulatory regimes that multinationals can opt into. So you have the problem of selection. Right? You have to deal with the fact that the firms that are affected by different tax policies are different from some fundamental way. A second issue is that if you think about firm-level effects, they might not capture what you really care about at the end of the day, which is how the behavior of multinationals impact the broader economy. Right? So you want to think about spillover effects in local labor markets or in the economy as a whole. Okay, so this is kind of like the challenges that keep me up at night. And then what I'm going to try to tell you about today are different ways in which we've tried to, over the years, address some of these challenges. So I'm going to talk about 3 different strategies that kind of try to address these issues. The first is to use a local labor markets approach. I'm going to talk about a couple of different papers that have taken this local labor markets approach to think about the spillover effects of policies that impact multinationals. The second is to, instead of thinking of these firm comparisons as being causal effects, and what we do in a lot of the research, is more to just understand that when we're making these firm comparisons of firms that select to adopt different tax structures, that there's going to be some selection process that's determining these firm changes. And so the strategy there is going to be to combine what we think is like careful data work documenting how firms change when they adopt these structures with a model of selection to try to understand both the behavior of multinationals and how that impacts, say workers and investment. And then the third approach is going to be to incorporate qualitative methods into the analysis, right? So a lot of the work that we're kind of trained to do is to just take the data, do a lot of regression analysis, and oftentimes we don't do a lot to actually go talk to people and find out about exactly what they're thinking, how they're responding to these different tax incentives. And so in this last third strategy, I'm going to be thinking about how to use qualitative interviews to complement quantitative work. Okay. All right, so let's talk about the first strategy where we're going to be comparing firm-level effects of policies with local labor market effects. The setting for this first strategy is going to be a paper that I've been working on for a number of years. It used to be called Unintended Effects of Eliminating Tax Havens. Now it's going to be called Real Effects of Eliminating Tax Havens per decisions of people, that are in charge of the paper. Okay, so in this paper, the question that we're trying to answer is what happens when you eliminate tax havens? Are there real effects in the economy? And the setting that we're going to be thinking about is a particular provision in the US called Section 936. So this was a provision that basically made it so that if a US multinational had operations in Puerto Rico, the profits from those Puerto Rico were going to go untaxed, right? And the key thing here is not that the profits represent activity from Puerto Rico, but that U.S. multinationals could have operations in the U.S. and then ship those profits to Puerto Rico, right? So at the end of the day, what this policy is doing, it's limiting the ability of U.S. multinationals to shield the U.S. operations from taxation, right? So Section 936 was unique as a quote-unquote tax haven for the U.S. multinationals because it gave basically immediate repatriation at a zero tax rate, right? If multinationals wanted to go to a different tax haven, say they wanted to move to the Bahamas or the Cayman Islands or Ireland, that would give you the benefit of deferral, maybe a lower tax rate, but that's going to be less than the benefit of having immediate taxation from Section 936. So the fact that it was unique means that U.S. multinationals were not able to substitute as much between different profit-shifting strategies. So as a consequence, what we find is that when you repeal Section 936, there's an increase in the effective tax rates of U.S. multinationals. Now, when U.S. policymakers were thinking about this provision, what they were thinking is, how is this provision impacting activity in Puerto Rico? Right? They weren't actually thinking about what's going on in the U.S. mainland. But it turns out that the multinationals that use this provision employed about 11 million workers in the U.S. mainland. Right? And what we're going to do in this paper is try to understand how the repeal of this provision impacted those workers and the communities in which they lived. Right? So what we're going to do is we're going to first do some firm-level analysis, trying to compare firms that benefited or could have benefited from Section 936 to firms that did not, and then we're going to compare those firm-level effects to these local labor market effects. So this is first graph is kind of to motivate the timeline and the scale of the policy. So starting in 1995, we see this big decline in the tax credits that are being paid out by this policy. The policy is phased out between 1996 and 2006. And as you can see, this is broken out by different industries. So chemical manufacturing is this big brown mass, and that's basically pharma, right? So when we think about profit-shifting multinationals, pharma can play a big role. In this case, it was one of the most important industries. So the first thing we're going to do in this paper is try to think, okay, what happens at the firm level? Do we actually see firm-level responses? So what we do is we use data from NETS. NETS is a firm-level data set that allows us to look at the activities of the establishments and where they operate. This allows us to identify which companies had operations in Puerto Rico, and we say, if you had operations in Puerto Rico, you're a firm that could have potentially benefited from Section 936. Then what we're going to do is we're going to take the employment of the continental U.S. for all of those firms and compare the firms that had establishments in Puerto Rico to other firms that look similar on some margins, but that were not in Puerto Rico. So this is going to be a pretty simple event study design where we look at the percentage change in employment relative to 1995, and where exposure is just going to be 0, 1. Did you have exposure to Puerto Rico or not? And what we see here is that as the policy is being phased out, we see a significant decline in the employment in the U.S. mainland for these corporations, right? So again, policymakers were really more worried about what was going to happen in Puerto Rico. There's really not immediately an effect in Puerto Rico. Afterwards, the repeal of Section 936 over a long time does have significant effects in Puerto Rico. There are other papers by Saria Feliciano that kind of study that issue. But they weren't really focused on how this was going to impact activities in the U.S. mainland. Okay, so this is the firm level effect. So one could say, okay, we've done the firm level thing. We can just call it quits and say, like, this is the effect. Now, here is the concern. These firm level analysis, on one hand, they could understate or they could overstate the overall effects of this policy, right? So one possibility is that workers might switch from the firms that were declining employment, move to a different firm, and they're going to be employed nonetheless, right? So maybe in that case, that graph might be overestimating the effects of the policy. Alternatively, if there are local agglomeration effects, so that if you live in a location that had a lot of pharmaceutical employment, and now pharma is kind of like declining, maybe all the ecosystem around that industry starts declining as well, right? So if those agglomeration effects are large, these can amplify the losses from these firm level effects. So what we're going to do to try to think about these agglomeration effects is we're going to use a local labor market approach. So the idea here is that we're going to use this network of establishments of U.S. multinationals, and we're going to compute for every county what's the fraction of establishments that could have benefited from this policy. Once we have that map, then we can engage in a different type of comparison. Instead of looking at firms to firm comparison, we can compare places. And when we have places, we have more places than multinationals that are participating in this program to begin with, and we also just a little bit more familiar about how to compare places that are more similar to others than say making firm level comparisons, which can be a little bit trickier. Okay, so this is basically that map where we calculate for every county what's the share of establishments that have some connection to Puerto Rico. And what's kind of interesting here is that even within a given state, you see a lot of variation in this exposure. So for one example, I used to live in Durham, which is right there. And Durham has this Research Triangle Park that is basically this agglomeration of different research companies that operate in the same place. And there's a lot of pharma technology there. Right? And so, the difference between being in this Durham area versus in other parts of North Carolina, that's kind of the comparison that we're trying to make, right? Is the employment trends in the Durham area going to behave differently than in other areas that are nearby, but are not that different from Durham? So in this setting, the comparisons are pretty simple. What we do is basically we're going to take data from the quarterly census of employment and wages, which is some kind of like larger county level data set. It's actually county industry level data set. And we're just going to plot by tercile of exposure. So we're going to basically take this map and classify which counties are in the top tercile, which counties are in the bottom tercile of the ones that are exposed. And we're just going to plot means, right? So this is just basically a means graph of the percentage change in employment. And so what you can see here is prior to 1995, the places that have more exposure to Section 936 and those that had less exposure were kind of on a similar trend. But afterwards, you see this big divergence with the yellow line showing the locations that have higher exposure, those see lower employment growth. Right? And so that's kind of the way in which we can think this firm level effect transferring to the local labor market. We can do this a little bit more formally by thinking about a regression specification that includes different levels of fixed effects, different sets of controls. And again, we have a very simple graph here where we show no parallel trends. And then afterwards, we see this decline where the timing basically matches that phase out between 1996 and 2006 of the policy. In this regression, we've normalized this beta coefficient so that we can think of it as being the effect of moving from the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile of the exposure distribution. And if you want to think about, in 2006, once the policy is fully phased out, what we find is that an increase from an interquartile range increase in exposure lowered employment growth by about 7.8% by 2006. Right? Okay, so another way to kind of think about that effect and to compare it to the effect in the firm level effect is to basically say, okay, we're going to take the average number of firms that were in a given area, look at that direct effect, and compare it to the effect that we find from this local labor market effect. I'm going to spare you some of the details of that calculation, but what we end up finding at the end of the day is that for every job that is lost in a Section 936 firm, an additional 3 workers are also lose their job in the local area. Right? So there's basically a local multiplier effect due to these agglomeration economies. So usually when we think about policies that impact multinationals, we're just thinking about the multinationals themselves. We're not thinking about the communities where they operate. What this comparison between firm level effects and local labor market effects tells us is that it's also important to go that next step and think about the locations where these multinationals are operating, because these places may have long-lasting effects, right? So a comparison that I like to make in this setting is to, recent work in trade that has shown that, if you're exposed to trade competition, say from China or from NAFTA, that could have long-lasting effects in employment growth. I'm not going to get into the debate as to whether or not trade is good or bad. That's not the point. The point is, I think part of that new research has shown, well, it's not longer that new, but that part of that research has shown that there are these long-lasting effects that last longer than we previously thought. And when we think about international tax policies, I think what this is showing is a similar result, right? The nimbleness of the U.S. economy is not as fast as to really be able to absorb a lot of these shocks very quickly. Right? And that's something that we want to take into account when we kind of give policy advice. Like I mentioned at the beginning, I don't want to spend a lot, the little time that I have talking about robustness checks and that kind of stuff, but I think a key thing that often comes up when you do this local labor market analysis is that you do have to connect the policy to the actual local labor market, or the actual treatment of interest, right? So here we actually had firms where we could see the firm level behavior, and then we have the local labor market effect. But we do a lot of work in these kind of papers to try to rule out other potential channels. So here's a graph where we've taken that baseline 7.8% effect, and we're basically trying to throw at every other story that we've heard in seminars, added, different types of job incentives, different types of tax policies, exposure to things like trade, changes in tax revenue, exposure to routine jobs, all the things that were happening at that time, and that's not really what's driving this. But I'm not trying to say this is the most important part of the graph for this project, but what I'm trying to say is when one writes this kind of papers, it's important to be able to kind of tie really the mechanism to the effect that we're finding. Okay. Now, well, this is a little bit of a challenge in that you do have to convince readers that the effect is driven by the mechanism you have in mind. There are other opportunities, which are that you can look at other outcomes that would also be of interest, right? So in addition to look at unemployment, we can use data from the US Census to try to think about not just employment or say average earnings, but to think about wages, right? Which is something that I think is closer to revenue. So similar to decrease in employment, we find that exposure to Section 936 at the local level declined wages for low-skilled workers and for high-skilled workers, although the decline is larger for low-skilled workers. We also find that being exposed to Section 936 led to a decline in home values and in rents. And it also led to increases in government transfers, right? So accompanying that increase or the decrease in employment, we see increases in unemployment insurance and increases in other forms of income transfer programs that we have in the US, right? So again, when we're thinking about international tax policies, we want to go beyond thinking just about the firm level effects and incorporating these other fiscal externalities that could be significant. Okay, so this is kind of like the first project that I wanted to talk about, where we go from this firm level effect to this local labor market effect. The key takeaways for me here is that these effects at the local labor market are capturing additional spillover effects that we should think about. And also that these longer lasting effects on the local labor markets should be part of the debate. It's something that we don't actually think about that much, but I think that they should be part of the debate. One of the things that I've been trying to pitch people at Treasury is to try to come up with a distribution of which locations in the US are more affected by different tax provisions. Right, because I think that could get us closer to understanding when we make policy, what is the geographic component of these different tax policies. So when we started writing this paper, Dan Garrett, who I showed you earlier, was my grad student at Duke. And then we kind of had a lot of fun with this kind of approach and said, okay, what else can we do with this approach that we can think about in the space of international tax? And so that became a second paper where we also joined up with Eric Orn. And I'm going to show you a second example where we use this local labor market effects as an empirical setting. So in this paper, we're trying to figure out whether or not other tax policies for international taxation that the US has, whether or not they impact domestic workers. So we're going to be thinking about two policies. One is in 1997, the introduction of check the box regulations, and the other is the 2004 repatriation holiday. So the way to think about check the box NTA elections is that prior to 1997, whenever two foreign affiliates of US multinationals had transactions between them, those transactions could be subject to a form of a tax, right? It's called a subpart F tax. So for instance, if you had a German affiliate and an Irish affiliate, if the German affiliate wanted to make a payment to the Irish affiliate for, say, the use of intellectual property, prior to 1997, that would be subject to a tax. What the check the box regulations allowed is for the multinational to basically check the box on one of their foreign affiliates, and now the US is only going to treat both of those foreign affiliates as a consolidated entity so that the transactions between those foreign affiliates are no longer subject to tax. So the effect that has is that from the US perspective, US multinationals may not be paying as much tax in Germany because now they're making profit shifting type payments to the Irish affiliates, and that lowers the effective tax rate of doing business abroad. So that's the role of check the box. The repatriation holiday instead was a one-time event where they lowered the effective tax rate on repatriations from foreign affiliates. So in this time, the US had a worldwide tax system. And so to encourage multinationals to bring money back home, Congress decided to give them a temporary tax holiday. Both of these provisions were motivated by the idea that, maybe the US government could do with some less revenue, but if it would increase the global competitiveness of US multinationals, maybe that would be worth it, right? So the questions that we have in this paper is it really the case that by increasing the competitiveness of domestic multinationals, you actually create jobs and raise wages at home? And what we're going to do is use this local labor market approach to test this belief. So I already explained the role of subpart F. Again, the idea is that subpart F is going to allow some of these payments between affiliates to no longer be immediately taxed under subpart F. And that's going to basically lower the tax rate that US multinationals pay abroad. Right? So the question that we care about from the US perspective is, does it matter if US multinationals are paying less taxes on their foreign operations? It could also matter for Germany. They might not like it or they might like it. But at least from the US perspective, if we're thinking about US multinationals, do we care if US multinationals are paying less taxes for their operations in Germany or not? Right? From the perspective of the business community, they think like, okay, it's going to improve our business, our global competitiveness, so it's good for our global champions. Is it also good for the local labor markets where these multinationals operate? So similar to the other paper, we're going to use the NETS data to try to map the distribution of employment of multinationals. So here we're going to take the share of 1996 local employment in multinationals using this link between CompuStat data and NETS data. So CompuStat data is just going to be the financial statements data. So again, similar to the 936 project, there's a lot of variation within states. In this case, however, it turns out that the places that are exposed to multinationals are actually look different than the ones that are not exposed to multinationals. Right, so I think in the Section 936 paper, I could just plot those tertile graphs, and you could just see like the result fell immediately. In this case, we have to do a little bit more work to try to make sure that the comparisons that we're making across locations are comparisons that we're comfortable with. So we're going to basically deal with these differences in observable characteristics in a couple of different ways. One is we're going to take characteristics of the locations that we observe, and we're going to interact them with year fixed effects. So we're going to basically control for some observables. And then another thing we can do is basically say, okay, we're going to try to predict which locations have high exposure to multinationals, use that as a propensity score, and reweight the observations to try to make them more comparable. At the end of the day, we can use both approaches individually or together, and we find very similar results. Once we basically either have these controls or do this reweighting analysis, we can again go back to this classic difference in difference empirical strategy, where again the identification assumption here, we want to have comparisons of places that look similar, but at the end of the day, it's going to be a parallel trends assumption. Right? We're going to assume that absent the repeal of section of check the box, absent the introduction of check the box, these different places are going to trend in similar way. And one way to kind of like see whether or not this assumption makes sense is to look at the trends before the introduction of check the box. So this is basically the main graph from that paper. We have this change in 1997. In the paper, we kind of like show how controlling for different sets of characteristics leads to basically the similar graph. So the results are pretty robust to all these controls. But at the end of the day, the main diagnostic check for this paper is that there's no pre-trends prior to 1996. Right? To get a sense of the magnitudes here, what we find is that by 2003 to 2006, the places that are more exposed to US multinationals see employment declines by about 3% relative to 1996. So if you think about the places that are actually exposed to or highly exposed to US multinationals, employment in those counties is going to be about 33 million jobs. So 3% of 33 million jobs, that's about 1 million jobs. Right? So what we're saying is that between 1997 and 2006, the places that were more exposed to multinationals had a relative decline in employment of about 1 million jobs. Now let's think about that number of 1 million jobs together with the number that I gave you before of having a local employment multiplier of 3. Right? So to kind of think about the firm level effects and the local labor market effects, think of US multinationals reducing their employment domestically in the US by 250,000 jobs, right? Now you take those 250,000 direct jobs, multiplied by 3, that's 750, right? So together that gives us the million job decline, right? So that's how we can get to some of these numbers. Now, is that number that kind of makes sense? Well, we can compare that 250,000 decline in firm-level employment to the increase in employment by U.S. multinationals abroad. So from surveys from the BEA, we know that the foreign employment of U.S. multinationals grew by 3 million jobs in this time period. In the EU alone, it grew by 1.3 million jobs. Right? So what we're saying here is check the box had the effect of lowering taxes from activities abroad, say activities in Germany. During this time period, we know that U.S. multinationals increased their employment abroad significantly. We also have evidence now that there's a decline in employment at home. Right? So this graph, going back to this question of do policies that increase the global competitiveness of U.S. multinationals help workers? This graph is saying at least this policy was not one way to actually help U.S. workers. Now, again, coming back to what are the challenges in using this kind of research design? I think when we're trying to publish this paper, one of the challenges that we face is try to really convince the reader that this is driven by check the box and not something else. In the case of Section 936, we had a bit of an easier time because we had the firm level effect. In the case of check the box, it's really, really hard. And the reason is basically all multinationals use check the box. And so it's really hard to have a comparison between multinationals because basically all of them are treated. Right? So what, in the absence of having this firm level variation, we're going to try a number of strategies to try to rule out all other kinds of stories. So we've done 5 things in the paper to try to show that this effect is most likely driven by things related to check the box. First, we do see that multinationals see a large drops in effective tax rates that match that pattern of adoption of check the box in 1997. We find larger effects for counties that are exposed to multinationals that had the most to gain from check the box because they have different effective tax rates before 1997. We also find that the timing of these labor market effects match the timing of adoption of check the box over time. So that kind of timing matches. And then we can rule out a couple of other stories directly, like we look at exposure to offshoring of jobs. We look at exposure to, or issues having to do with the race to the bottom in the OECD, because a potential story would be that it's not that the US made it so that multinationals could have lower taxes in Europe, but that European countries themselves were lowering their own tax rates. And it was that decline in that in those tax rates that led to the employment decline in the US. What we find there is that if we split the sample by being exposed to countries that had the largest tax rates, tax cuts in the OECD, that is not really what explains the results. Yet another possible story would be that it's not really the fact that US multinationals now have a lower effective tax rate when they earn the money abroad, but that when they have the money abroad, it is now basically stuck abroad because of the repatriation tax. Right? So during this time period, because the US had a worldwide tax system, if the US multinationals wanted to bring the profits that they had abroad back home, they had to pay a repatriation tax. So one way to kind of think about this possible concern is to use the repatriation holiday in 2004. Right? So this repatriation holiday gave a tax cut of 85%, or decreased the rate by 85% if multinationals brought the money back between 2004 and 2006. If it's the case that it's this kind of repatriation tax that's preventing multinationals from using those profits and bringing them back home, we should see that following the repatriation holiday, there would be large increases in domestic employment. So we're going to use a very similar strategy where we're going to look at the geographic distribution of where the multinationals that brought money back home as a result of the holiday, where were they located and where was the money repatriated, and try to see whether or not being exposed, being in a county where there was more money that came in as part of the repatriation holiday, whether or not that led to employment growth. And basically the result is a null effect. Right? So basically what this graph is saying is that being in a county where a larger fraction of employment was in a multinational that benefited from the repatriation holiday did not have any effect on local employment growth. Right? Null effects can sometimes get a bit of a bad rap, but I think it's actually really useful when you're analyzing different types of treatments, and some are going to have an effect, some are going to have no effect, and I think having both together is kind of useful. So in this case, this null effect helps us rule out this potential compounding story. Okay. All right, so to kind of wrap up this discussion, what we're finding here is that these policies, like the check the box, they could have benefited U.S. multinationals and their competitiveness globally, but they really did not benefit local workers. If anything, what we're finding is that these tax policies that were meant to increase the competitiveness of U.S. multinationals actually did so at the expense of inducing offshoring. I want to check my time with Dominica. 23 more minutes. Okay. I know that it's been a long day, so I don't want to rush too much through some of these graphs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip the third paper that was looking at the structural estimation, and we're going to jump straight into the paper that looks at the qualitative interviews, because I find that to be super interesting, and we have some brand new results that I want to show people, and that way we'll have a little bit more time for Q&A at the end. Okay, so close your eyes for 2 seconds and, be sad that you didn't learn about all those different things. Okay, so instead let's think about this third qualitative data as an empirical strategy. So this paper is joined with Sebastian Bustos, Diana Pomeranz, Jose Villavelde, and Gabriel Suckman. And in this paper, we're going to be studying a reform in Chile that introduced transfer pricing regulations that were basically motivated by the OECD. When Chile was decided to enter into the OECD, it had to adopt these regulations. So this Chilean transfer pricing reform happened between 2011 and 2013, and it really transformed Chile from being a laggard in terms of the implementation of transfer pricing standards to being a leader pretty quickly. And the implementation was pretty strong in the sense that the government passed laws that changed how companies had to justify their transfer pricing assumptions, and in particular, the burden of proof, from it being that the tax authority had to prove that the company had done something wrong, to instead now making it so the company had to prove that they had done something right? So it really changed the system. And in addition, the Chilean government also created basically a division in their tax revenue office that specialized in transfer pricing. I know Dina likes to make this point when she presents this paper, which is that Chile is actually a very high capacity country that can implement a lot of different reforms very well. So for people who are not familiar with the setting, this is a setting where we would think that introducing this kind of reform, it would actually be an effective setting. When we started this project, I think was meant to be much more of a, let's use all the administrative data in the world to try to really study the effect of this reform. I think this project has more different types of administrative tax data than I've used in any other paper. So for instance, it has data on the tax revenue, like basically the tax payments of all the multinationals. Then it also has data on the transactions between the foreign affiliates and the parent of Chilean multinationals. And it also has data on trade. So we know if multinationals trade with one another or they trade with different countries, we know product by product how much they paid and whether or not the transfer price was manipulated, right? So we have basically all the different margins that you could imagine could impact or could be margins for profit shifting. We have payments for royalties, payments for interest, payments for service abroad, payments for goods that are being imported and exported. And what happens when we use all this admin tax data and our usual causal inference toolkit to study the effect of the regulation is a lot of null effects. And again, these is what the data is showing, so it's good to report them, but it can be a little bit discouraging if you think that one of these regulations is going to have a big impact. So in particular, what we find is that there's no reduction in the sensitivity of intragroup payments to foreign tax rates. So the way that we think about measuring the existence of profit shifting to begin with is we first show that when multinationals are making payments to foreign affiliates, they are more responsive to differences in tax rates than they are to non-affiliates, right? So the idea is if you're trying to engage in transactions that are going to lower your profits in Chile, you're going to basically pay more to the places that where you can shift the profits to. So we find no reduction in the sensitivity of intergroup payments. We find no changes in unit prices for imports or exports. So if you think about profit shifting on the goods side, we're not finding it there. And if we compare Chilean multinationals to Chilean domestic firms, but that are otherwise internationally active, so firms that are engaged in importing and exporting, if we use like a simple difference around the reform, we find no effect in their overall tax payments. Right? So again, no effects on the sensitivity of all the different kinds of channels for profit shifting, and no effects on tax payments. So what this kind of sets of analysis show us is that the reform didn't really reduce profit shifting or increase tax collection, which was the intended effect of the reform. So we kind of found that and said, like, okay, this is kind of troubling. We have to understand what's going on here. And I think this is a big credit again to Dina, because she is a person that when she does research, she really engages a lot with local people and really tries to understand the setting. And even before we started doing this analysis, she had already done a lot of interviews with local accountants and people in the tax authority. And when this happened, we said, okay, let's do a little bit more deeper qualitative analysis. And so we kind of formalized using semi-structured interviews how we're going to get information that we had before the reform and then information that we get after the reform to try to understand how is it that multinationals responded to this reform. So we have 6 findings from these qualitative interviews that I'm going to walk you through. So the first is that the tax reform fueled growth in the advisory industry. The second is that the reform first sparked demand for compliance support. So at the beginning, multinationals would approach consulting firms, and the first thing they needed to do is, how do I comply with this new set of regulations? But then there's a really interesting complementarity that arises between compliance and tax planning, right? Once the accounting firms realize that they can understand all the business of the multinationals, then they start coming up with different ways that they can minimize their taxes, right? So there's this complementarity that's driven by the reform to engage in tax planning. A fourth fact that I think is really interesting is that these big 4 accounting firms are very agile in the way that they can respond to these reforms. And the way to think about this is, these are OECD standardized regulations. So if a different country, say Venezuela, had already implemented them, when they came to Chile, they already had the technology of how to actually respond to these reforms. Right? So it was easy for them to move some of the resources they have in neighboring countries and then to build on their own capacity in Chile. One of the responses that the accountants mentioned to us is that one way that multinationals can reduce their taxes is by consolidating cost centers in strategically chosen locations, and that's something that we can actually verify with the tax data. And then finally, a 6th fact that we find is that when you talk to the accountants about this race between the tax authority and the multinationals, it just looks like the tax authorities are completely outgunned and outmaneuvered. And we're going to show you some patterns of particular revolving door patterns, where it shows that the accountants are coming in and out of government and playing both a role in how the policies are being written, but also going back into industry and helping multinationals comply with them in ways that also minimize their taxes. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little more depth between each of these findings. When you do this kind of qualitative analysis, this is the second paper where we've done these kind of interviews. What you get is a lot of quotations, right? So it's kind of, I find it really interesting. So I'm going to read you some of those quotations, and then we're going to find ways to try to corroborate that either with tax data or with other data. So let's start with this idea that tax reform fueled advisory industry growth. So this is somebody from the Big 4 who was a consultant, said there was very little demand for such services prior to the reform. After the reform, the compliance cost for firms increased. It's not that clients often move from smaller consulting firms to the Big 4. Most clients were newly taking outside counsel for this. So this is just basically an increase in the demand for a particular sector. Another big consultant said, for the tax advisors, this whole thing is great. In 2011, we were a team of 2. Now we're a team of 26, right? So, this is, again, big demand shock. So, qualitative analysis is not just, as quotes. You can actually get data if you ask the firms. So this is data by where we asked all the Big 4 how many transfer pricing specialists they had before the reform and then after the reform. And you can just see that big increase at all 4 firms, right? So, when you show this to economists, they tend to be a little bit skeptical. They're kind of like, well, do they really remember how many people they had and what are they being motivated? These people want to think that, okay, this is, they want to think that they're growing their business because they're really good at it. And so they might be like over responding to this. So what we've done as a way to address some of these concerns is we got access to a data set that Kevin found, and then that Jason Harrison, the prereq that I showed you, analyzed very deftly, which is called Rebellion. Rebellion basically digitizes all the LinkedIn profiles that people have. And you can basically build a linked employer-employee data set where you know where all the transfer pricing specialists in Chile, where they worked. So we know if they started a Big Four, if they moved to a multinational, or if they moved back to the government. So with that data, we can basically reproduce this graph, and it looks like this. So that's the graph from the interviews. This is the graph from this linked employer-employee data. Now, the y-axis, we should make a graph that has exactly the same y-axis, so they're not exactly comparable. But you can see the pattern of there's been a lot of growth in this industry. We can corroborate it in both graphs. Now, one concern with this graph that you might have as an economist is kind of like, well, you're just showing me the change over time. Maybe what's going on here is that Chile is just growing a lot, right? Maybe it's just like all these industries are just experiencing this gigantic growth, and this 12-fold increase in the number of transfer pricing consultants, just all kinds of consultants are having the same kind of growth. So one thing we can do with the Rebellion data is basically compare the growth in the transfer pricing professionals to just basically general consultants in Chile. So you can see that there is some growth, Chile is growing, but it just does not match that growth in transfer pricing professionals. Right? Okay, so that's the first fact that, again, we got it from the interviews, we got the data, and now we can confirm with this additional data set on linked employer-employee data. Okay. So the second finding that we find is that the reform, the first thing they did, it just sparked demand for compliance support. So the first thing that they wanted was compliance. So this is a quote that says, the big majority of multinationals contracted the consultants for the new transfer pricing tax annex. So there's a tax annex that they have to submit with their tax returns. Some did it in-house at the beginning, but it was done poorly, and they received complaint notices from the tax authority. So the tax authority was actually implementing this, right? They're actually going through the tax annex, making sure that it was done right, and if it wasn't done right, they would go back to the firms. What did the firms do then? Well, then they went and started relying on the consultants. Right, so it was really this interaction with the tax authority that fueled the demand for these tax consultants. And again, the reason why the Big Four have an advantage of this is because they have the technology to do this, right? So this quote says, people need experts to have comparable benchmark databases that only the Big Four have, right? So when you've done all these transfer pricing studies and you know how to do it well, those things are more portable across firms, and there's benefits in being like a big firm that does that. Okay, so now, if you're a multinational, you've approached an accounting firm to get help with the compliance. What happens then is, well, there's going to be a complementarity between compliance and tax planning. I think this is also a very interesting pattern. So this is a quote from a Big Four consultant that says, the better one knows the company, the more one learns more efficient ways to deal with taxes. I now work a lot with accountants at the GSB, and the word efficient, tax efficient for accountants and tax efficient for economists, it has a very different meaning. So tax efficient in this case means you're not paying taxes. So this other person said, in the first years, companies were only focused on compliance. We told them every year about tax planning services. So basically said, you're losing money on one transaction and another. Sooner or later, they started to make changes to the transfer prices. Consulting firms see tax planning as a growth opportunity, so they focus on selling tax plan. Right? So once you've actually learned how the business works, you understand their books, now you can sell them the tax planning services. Okay, so again, another fact that I thought was really interesting is how the Big Four are able to respond on the supply side, right? So far we're basically talking about the demand side. The supply side is also really interesting. So at the beginning, the transfer pricing partners of the Big Four were all foreigners. The advantage for transfer pricing specialists is that rules are international, so people can move around. Right, so there's this idea that if you have standardized OSC regulations, if one country adopts them, another country can use the same experts. This in-house accountant said something similar. At the beginning, all the tax planning experts were foreigners in the Big Four. We brought in the seniors from abroad, Argentina, Venezuela, and Colombia, and then recruited assistants who were Chilean. Today, about 40% of the senior transfer pricing experts are Chileans. So first you bring in this foreign talent, and then you grow in your own national set of experts. So again, when we think about incidents, we think about supply and demand, and I think this is a way of thinking about the responsiveness of the supply side in this market. Okay, so a particular strategy that was mentioned in the interviews was the idea of cost center centralization. So this consultant said, many companies start to centralize several activities. For example, instead of having a distributed presence in all countries, they order from one optimally chosen location. Another accountant said, centralizing cost centers is very common, not only from the point of view of taxes, but efficiency in general. So here they actually have some kind of concept of economic efficiency and how they can improve the business. But this is something that we can take to the data, right? Because we know from the tax data the number of foreign countries that they're making payments for, either for affiliates or for non-affiliate firms. And so here what we have is basically before and after the reform, what is the number of countries that you make a payment, comparing payments to affiliates versus payments to non-affiliates. And here what we see is that after the reform, there's a decrease in the number of payments to affiliated firms, which is consistent with this idea that you would consolidate cost centers abroad in a way that would minimize taxes. Okay, so the last insight that we have from these interviews is just the interplay between the tax authority and the multinationals. So these are three quotes that I think they get more depressing as you go along. So the first is, there are many, many more people in the consulting firms, and they are better trained than the team in the tax authority. Right? So that's something that a Big Four consultant said. Another consultant of a small firm said, the guy who wrote the regulation for the Chilean transfer pricing reform was subsequently hired for a very high salary by a Big Four. Right? Okay, so that, I don't want to name names, but we also know that people who just work at the OECD also now work at consulting firms, right? So this is not something that just happens in Chile. This is like a global pattern. This other quote says, the Big Four, of course, benefit when the tax authority audits. The more audits, the better it is for the Big Four, right? So that's the source of their business. So again, we use these kind of quotes and we try to think, okay, let's go back to our linked employer-employee data set. How can we characterize this pattern in the data? And so this is a graph that my predictor Jason made that I think is just a fantastic graph. So this graph is basically a flow chart between three sectors. So you have the Big Four, the private sector and education, so basically university professors, and then the government, right? So the red flows tell you when people change jobs between the Big Four and the private sector, when they change jobs between the Big Four and government, right? So here is one side of the revolving door. The blue ones tell you the people who were at the government, where do they go? Some go to the private sector or to the universities, some go straight back to the Big Four, right? So that pattern that we saw of, the person who wrote the regulations now went back to the Big Four. That's basically, this is the revolving door, right? So I think, again, using these kind of interviews to get more context into why we're finding what we're finding with the administrative data, and then combining it with this other firm or like worker level data, it's kind of a way to increase what we can say about international tax reforms and the context in which multinationals respond to these reforms. Again, some takeaways from this paper. In general, we're finding basically no profit shift in reduction and no significant increase in tax collection, but large increase in tax advisory services. For me, thinking about the role of accountants has now become something that I want to work a lot more on, because I feel like it's kind of like an intermediary in the sector that I think I want to understand better and try to understand how is it that they facilitate or contribute to the business of multinationals in general. But I think that's something where we can do more work. And I think this example hopefully shows the value of a mixed method approach. The interviews were crucial for explaining why we have these null effects, but then combining this with this Rebellio Labs data also allows us to corroborate what we're finding in the interviews, which can sometimes be something that'd be hard for economists to really get behind. All right, so just there we go. Okay, so just to conclude, I continue to believe that the decisions made by by general multinationals carry broad implications. They matter for tax revenue, but they also matter for employment, for innovation, and for other things. And so I think there are a lot of important questions that we need to answer in this area. And even though we're not the direct beneficiaries of some of these revolution in the administrative tax data because of the challenges that I mentioned at the beginning, there are different approaches that can help us answer some of these important questions. One approach is to look beyond the firm level and try to understand the spillover effects at the local labor market level. Another approach that I was not able to get into today was to combine structural modeling with stylized facts of how firms change in response to the adoption of specific strategies, and try to use that to quantify the role of selection or to conduct counterfactual simulations, and then finally to use these qualitative methods to help contextualize the findings from this empirical work. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Juan Carlos. So we have, I think, around 3 minutes for questions. Okay, Jakob.
Thanks a lot. Fantastic speech. Jakob Mieter from the University of Munich. I am very impressed that you admit to using qualitative evidence, which we all do, but you say it and you structure it. And I was wondering what your experience was like with that in the professional kind of feedback that you get. Did you have to do everything quantitative that you would have to do anyways? And then people said, oh, nice that you also do some qualitative stuff, or was it actually rewarded? And following up on that, would you recommend this for other researchers, and at what stage of their career?
It's a fantastic question. So I'm going to give you my very honest response. And I think it's tricky because, we all, when we write papers, we feel that we're being unfairly maligned and, we've done everything right and all the referees are wrong. And so, if we had written a paper that instead of qualitative interviews that had a structural model, maybe I'd be complaining about the fact that they complain about the structural model. So I don't know what the counterfactual is of the complaints. But having said that, yes, we faced some pushback from a lot of referees saying like, oh, I don't really see the value of this. These are just anecdotes. Like, what do we actually do with this? And some of the work that has gone into using this linked employer-employee data is a response to try to validate some of that. Now, you talked about when in their career should people do this. And one of the things that has been very encouraging when working with qualitative data is that when you talk to people, it's been a lot of the younger economists that have come up to us and be like, oh, that's really cool. Like, I wish we did more of that. And so, I think it's a risky thing, but I think it's a risk that if taken, in a smart way, I think can pay off for people. So, we're not the first to do qualitative methods, and we're not really quite experts on them. So I would like to learn more about how to, conduct these interviews in a better way. But I know that there are also other people that are using them and that have paved the way for economists as well. But I would, I would recommend that people consider them because I think you learn a lot. The other paper where I've used them is in a paper on energy regulation in China, and some of the quotes that we get there are just fantastic. I think that's it's awesome.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. That's a very informative discussion as expected. I want to ask you, the dynamic in the tax services industry in Chile sounds very familiar. You can see that in the United States, you can see that in Germany. And so there's a question, when you propose the local labor market approach, that's a generalizable extension of whatever you find on the firm level, are you proposing to do this, more generally for international tax? So I can imagine the global minimum tax producing the same result. Would you do this extension only when you find a null result, or would you do that just as a matter of course? Because what's interesting about the labor market approach is that it generates very unexpected results, right? One is reduce employment, the other is one policy is against M&E, the other is in favor of M&Es. Both reduce employment, which is sort of very interesting. Yeah.
So this is a great question because it allows me to talk about a different paper. So we have a paper with Danker and with Eric Orn, where we look at the local labor market effects of bonus depreciation. And then we also find that being in areas where there are more industries that benefit from bonus depreciation, that leads to more employment growth. So I think there are other ways, a question that I would love to be able to answer, because I think it's kind of like a hypothesis that comes from this check the box study, is we're basically saying like we think that there are places in Europe that benefited from US multinationals having a lower effective tax rate abroad. And it would be great to actually approach that for the local labor markets approach. So is it the case that local labor markets in Germany that have more employment by US multinationals, that those grow more than the ones that didn't have as much employment by US multinationals? That's a question that, if anybody wants to work on that, I'd be happy to work with them. If not, I hope you track it down and either prove it right or wrong. So.